This is Mike at DOT Compliance Help with another discussion of an NTSB report. Now, this one's pretty unusual for me because, my point is a lot of people do NTSB reports analysis and discussion, but they're always talking about the plane crashes. The biggest reason I'm doing this, or one of the biggest reasons, is nobody ever talks about the highway crashes. Now, there's a lot of railroad crashes. I mean, how do you define crash? More than most people realize. Trains derail, but there's only a few crew members on a train, and there's very often not a lot of injuries or fatalities. But I heard on the news when this happened back in 2022, there was this train wreck, and it happened really close to Kansas City, and the name of the town was Mendon, the closest town. And I think I actually knew somebody that was from there. And I kind of made a note to myself. I want to try to remember to get to read the NTSB report when it comes out. But, I was busy and I forgot. And about a year and a half or 2 years later, I was getting a uniform mended, and the cleaners said they'd have it in a couple of months. And several months later, I went back and it wasn't done. And they had sent it out to somebody that was doing that work for them, and they just told me to go see this person. So I went to see this lady that's doing some clothing alterations in her home, and she apologized to me. She said she was almost a year behind on her work because she'd been injured in a train wreck. She was in this crash, and that reminded me to look for the NTSB report. She was a really nice lady, and she was on her feet, but I think she had some back injuries and what have you. So here's the bottom line. This Kenworth gravel truck, they're hauling some material. They're crossing over back and forth on this rail grade crossing, and the rail grade crossing was way out in the middle of nowhere, and there's not crossing gates. It's what they call an inactive crossing. There's another word for it. So the guy's on a gravel road, and there was another truck driver behind him that said, "Yeah, we've both been going back and forth across this, and that rail grade crossing is really steep, and these old trucks are loaded pretty heavy, and they're not overpowered, and we only got 4 or 5 gears, so what we have to do is take a run at it." So in other words, they weren't really making the legally required stop between 15 and 50 feet, and they kind of said they couldn't. And that's kind of a judgment thing. But in a perfect world, I would say if you can't stop to see if there's a train coming, you shouldn't be crossing there. And that might mean you have to go 20 miles out of your way to another crossing. And after this multiple fatality, that's exactly what happened. So the vehicles that were involved was the dump truck and a passenger train. I guess there were 3 people killed plus the truck driver. 3 people on the train and the driver, and 146 people injured. Well, 146 people that were transported to be examined. I mean, there could have been some minor injuries. The lady that I met was certainly part of that number, 156. So as I mentioned, a lot of train derailments happen. There's not a lot of fatalities, but the probable cause in this instance, the truck driver crossed the railroad tracks when he shouldn't have. He should have checked to see if there was a train coming, and they're legally required, we all know, to stop between 15 and 50 feet. When you really look at where the vegetation was, you couldn't see the train if you stopped 15 feet away. But if you stopped 50 feet back, I think they said you could see the train from there. So you could stop right there and say the driver's behavior was the root cause, and maybe you'd be right, but we haven't concluded a thorough examination until we acknowledge that the rail grade crossing was supposed to be improved. There was promises that it was going to be improved. There was an agreement between the railroad and the state highway department, but it hadn't been done. And the motor carrier should have said, look, it's just not safe to cross here. We're going to route these trucks down, 20 miles down the road. So I would say the root cause was the motor carrier didn't provide clear safety guidance. But the thing you're looking for is, could one of my drivers do this? Is it possible that one of my drivers is going someplace and he could make a decision like this? What can you do to make it less likely to happen? And I think the answer here is just make sure that you find the time to do the refresher training, depending on how often your drivers are crossing a railroad in this type of circumstance. If it never happens, well, maybe that refresher training needs to be done once every 5 or 6 years. But if it happens frequently, then maybe you need to do this refresher training every year. There didn't seem to be a lot of medical issues or fatigue issues, and they looked really hard at the train crew, the same thing. But this passive crossing was kind of an issue. Here's the location of it. You got 271 people on the train, and the truck was loaded with gravel. I believe this is a photograph that was taken from the engine of the train. They've got video cameras just like most automobiles do these days. And this was probably taken just a second before the crash. I think this picture was taken several days later after the railroad train had been set back up on the rails. When the first responders got there, this thing was laying on its side. The driver had made a couple trips that day, and the interesting thing is it's all transportation related. They were hauling aggregate from a quarry to the levee system. So here's your horizontal geometry. The way that the the way that the road crossed the rail, I think they said it was a 45-degree angle, which forces the driver to kind of look back over his shoulder in a perfect circumstance. But in this case, if this driver was this close to the railroad, apparently he would not have been able to see the train at all. Now, if he'd have stopped 50 feet back, he might have been able to see it. But based on the testimony from the other driver that was accompanying him on this trip, he couldn't have stopped that close. So he had to take a run at it. I'd like to think if he'd have stopped 50 feet back, though, he'd have seen the train. But, blaming the driver is something you can always do. The grade crossing vertical geometry, this is not supposed to be that steep. And again, the state highway department did close this crossing after this fatality. We talked about the vegetation, we talked about the vertical grade, and we talked about the horizontal crossing. Post-crash drug and alcohol, no real result there. Cell phone indicate. I'm almost surprised at this. The driver wasn't on his cell phone. I'm actually from this part of Missouri. Well, actually, I grew up a lot further south, but I'm pretty familiar with this area, and there might not have been any cell phone reception. The slope was a factor. The angle of the crossing was a factor. The condition of the gravel road was a factor, too. That was part of the reason the truck drivers said you can't stop on that slope, because if you did, you'd spin out trying to get started again, because that gravel road at that embankment is kind of mushy. So this talks about the steepness. The probable cause was certainly the truck driver crossed the track for unknown reasons, but I think the unknown reason is not a mystery we can't solve. I think complacency is the word. You're actually playing Russian roulette, and this is one of the things that all drivers should be told. You're playing Russian roulette when you close your eyes and cross a railroad track. The train might come by 4 or 5 times in a 24-hour period, so if you just close your eyes and drive across, 99 times out of 100, you'd be fine. But if you just keep doing it for years and years, eventually you might get hit by a train. And that's one of the points we need to make to drivers, especially inexperienced drivers. So the root cause, again, the driver of the truck made a bad decision, but what can you do now? Is it possible that one of your drivers might make the same mistake? And if so, let's talk about that refresher training. And if you're a big company in an area and you communicate with people like the state highway police or some local road board guys, maybe you can talk to them about making some capital improvements. But honestly, if you're in a situation where you're hauling something as a company where you have to cross a rail grade crossing in this circumstance, maybe you just need to drive 20 miles out of the way to avoid putting your drivers in that situation. But the key to this whole thing is, I don't want you to just take my word for it and say, well, that's what we need to do. I want you to look at this and other NTSB reports and study it. Remember, there's thousands of pages of information. Now, most of the information here, it's all focused on the railroad. There might actually be a Missouri Highway Police report on this, and I'm going to try to get it. And if I do, I might add some information to this, but I think we pretty much understand what happened. But as always, we can learn something from an NTSB report, and I kind of had my say. I'd like to hear your end of it. As always, if you've got questions or comments, please post below. Be safe and have a good day.